Welcome, comrades, brothers and sisters. The meeting today, through the chair, is the meeting is examine the failure of democracy and accountability within our movement. The Labour Party leadership, undemocratic, exercising dictatorship over its members and structures. This applies to the right-wing leadership and centralised bureaucracy within the movement, and that includes the trade union movement in some instances, allowing the victimisation of people like Paul Holmes in Unison is a prime example. The conference this year is in stark contrast to the one that I was last at in Liverpool. This is a party we are at a pivotal point, and in my opinion, it's imploding on itself, and have to rethink our political perspectives. The left are concentrating on shall we stay in or shall we leave? And I think there's not a contradiction there, but I think there's a wider aspect to that. The Labour Party is basically fundamentalist in its, it's fundamental, loyalist to the state and the crown. And that's the emphasis behind the Republican view that we hold within the LLA Republican Labour group. If you, as I do, believe in a campaign for a democratic socialist society, we need to be in a transition from what exists politically today. The demand for democracy, republicanism, internationalism and freedom, with a constitution for and by the people. The fight back situation, the tactics, the witch hunts and the expulsions should, in my opinion, be coupled with resistance and non-compliance. We seem to be fixated on the program of publicity. I'm not decrying that, I just think that it should be a joint thing. Members being expelled within the CLPs or suspended from office should have gone to the members and resisted the regional diktats. We should have been building the transition of networks, solidarity and trust within the membership. And I think that's been lacking from our campaign. And I heard last night at the JVL meeting, one comrade's criticism of the left being ununited and having not have a real resistance to the situation on the conference floor. And we saw, did we not, the debarring of Leah Levine. And I think there should have been a situation there whereby we should have called upon the Hastings delegates to be united with the Unite conference delegates to take to the floor and resist Levine's expulsion from the hall. And I thought that an excellent contribution yesterday was Ben Jolly, the delegate from Acton, put a fantastic case for opposing the current leadership within the Labour Party. So that's my contribution for this evening. I think what we'd like to do, we're able to call Steve in now as the first speaker. Steve Freeman from the LA Republican Labour Working Group.
Yes, I can hear you, but I can't seem to start my video at the moment.
Well, we can't see it from here. So.
I'll try to start my video. It doesn't want it. It says that you can't start your video because the host has stopped it. So I don't know why that is. Can somebody start the video for me? Well, I can always speak, comrades, without being seen. Shall I do that? If anybody can find a way of starting my video again, you can't start your video because it says the host has stopped it. Okay, comrades. So, okay, I'll just start anyway. Oh, I think, no. Are we about to begin?
You want to pursue that, Steve, or should
Oh,
we?
Shall I carry on? Am I waiting? I just a
Yeah.
clarification, Chair.
Carry on, Steve.
Okay, right, I'll start. Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you, Larry and comrades, for inviting me. I'm speaking here on behalf of the Republican Labour Working Group set up by the Labour Left Alliance to study and report back on ideas of Republican Labour. Republican Labour is essentially about the idea of transforming the Labour Party into a Republican Socialist Party, with reference, of course, to the 1992 Commonwealth Bill, which Tony Benn introduced into the House of Commons on more than one occasion, by the way. He was quite determined with that, although he didn't get anywhere with it. It's worthwhile thinking that, oh, there I am. It's worthwhile thinking that in the 1990s, the Labour Party had two opposite answers to Thatcher's destruction of the 1945 welfare state. The first was the policy of New Labour promoted by Blair and Brown. And the second was the idea of a democratic and social republic promoted by Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn. Now we know who won and who lost that battle. New Labour took power in 1997, and we know the rest of the history that took place from then. And we could then skip ahead to 2015 when Jeremy Corbyn was elected. The Corbyn movement reinvigorated socialism in the Labour Party, just as Bernie Sanders was doing something similar in America. But of course, we know that the Corbyn movement has been defeated, and Corbyn himself excluded from membership of the Parliamentary Labour Party. So what's happened is, in a way, that the Corbyn movement, the right wing of the Corbyn movement, evolved into something called Starmerism, for want of a better word. We never know what Starmerism is. But the left wing of the Corbyn movement has to go, in my opinion, back towards its roots in Bennite republicanism and democracy. And therefore the Labour Party needs to become, from a left perspective, a Republican Labour Party. Now, if we look at Starmerism, therefore, Starmerism versus Republicanism, the Labour Party will be forced into a struggle between these two poles. Nobody really knows what Starmerism is all about. We have been reading The Road Ahead, full of empty platitudes, published by the Fabians. He still pays lip service to Corbynism by saying on page 21, we must take inspiration from 1945. 1945 is a symbolic reference to the Corbyn programme. By including these words in his writing, Starmer's making a sort of pitch that he was of continuity Corbyn. That's how he pitched himself to become leader, with one major distinction. Starmer's vision or version of the social monarchy of the 1945 is to rely upon the capitalist class, and hence the crown, and not the working class. Hence, standing behind Starmer is Mandelson and Blair, whereas Corbyn's vision was to rely on the trade union movement and the working class. Purging Corbyn, therefore, and the socialist movement and the socialist wing of the party is the message to the capitalist class that they can now rely upon the Labour Party. Starmer makes, however, one interesting point. He says, we cannot dwell upon the past, that's the 1945 past, because we need a new settlement between the government, business and working people, and adds that this means completely rethinking where power lies in this country, completely rethinking where power lies in this country. And that's exactly what Tony Benn did in 1992. He completely rethought where power lies. And that's why he came to the conclusion that if we want to change the way in which power operates in this country, then the Crown in Parliament constitution is not fit for purpose. And the working class needs to establish its own independent position for a democratic and social republic. So that's the route out of Corbynism. On one side, it's towards Republican Labour and Tony Benn. On the other side, it's towards Starmer and Mandelson. And that's what we can see being played out. Well, at least one side of that being played out at this conference. Republican Labour, therefore, is not simply about having a new programme for the Labour Party, but it's also about having a different kind of Labour Party, one which is based on democratic Republican principles in how it operates. And we've seen what's been happening to democracy in the Labour Party during this conference. So I've got a few, 2 or 3 points to make. Got told them 2 or 3 points to make. The first one is to begin by examining the UK state. So I want to turn, therefore, to what I call the crisis of democracy we face in the country and in the Labour Party. Of course, the United Kingdom is a unionist constitutional monarchist state in which power is bureaucratically centralised and sovereignty vested in the Crown in Parliament. 2 fundamental pillars of the state are thus in the official name: the Union of England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and sovereignty vested in the Crown in Parliament. Now, the Crown in Parliament needs a little bit of explanation because people think it means the Queen and it doesn't. The Crown in Parliament means the sharing of power between capital, especially financial and landed capital, property, represented by the Crown, and the people represented in or by the House of Commons. And this is not the sharing of power, by the way, between capital and the people. It is not and has never been a democratic state. It's a liberal and highly centralized and bureaucratic state, which allows people to vote occasionally. It was described by Lord Hailsham, Tory Lord Hailsham, as an elected dictatorship. The Crown keeps the Commons under control. The Commons doesn't control the Crown. And if you want to see how farcical it is, you only got to watch Prime Minister's Question Time to see what a kind of pantomime farce this has become. So I want to say 3 things about this state and constitution very quickly. One is it's a failing state. I think that's the first thing to say about it. Despite the state managing a huge and very productive economy, £2 trillion economy, it has failed to plan and invest in its most productive asset, in the working class and the wider working population. You can think of your own examples, comrades. It's failed to plan and invest in health and social care. It's failed to plan and invest in transport and communications. It's failed to plan and invest in housing. Look at what happened at Grenfell Tower. It's failed to plan and invest in public services, in the prison service. It's failed to plan and invest in the education system. And we could go on. We've only got to look what's happening with gas and petrol today. We could go, and I won't go into it. The COVID crisis has exposed the failure to plan and invest in our health service, so that in the COVID crisis, the NHS was turned virtually into a COVID hospitals, basically. And we ended up with one of the world's highest death rates and the cancelling of operations, building up a massive waiting list, which have exposed, and we also exposed the complete failure of social care. So this is the failure of this state to plan and invest in what needs to be done. It's a dying state. The second point is it's a dying state. And I really want to refer to Michael Gove. It's always good to refer to him. He gave an interesting talk as the Chancellor of the Duchess of Lancaster. He gave the annual Ditchley annual lecture in July 2020. And he starts by quoting Gramsci, Prison Notebooks, which is kind of interesting. He says, the crisis consists precisely of the fact that the inherited is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And Gove is using this to explain the model of the current generation of political readers inherited a system which is crumbling, he says. and we're now in an age of morbid symptoms. So we have a system, a constitution, a system, a state which is not only failing, but it's dying. I want to turn to Gordon Brown next in the article on the case for radical federalism, where he quotes, it begins, this report begins by quoting Yeats saying, "Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold." And Brown is quoted in the Observer as saying that it will soon be impossible to hold together our multi-nation state of distinctive nations and regions within the straitjacket of a centralized state. And he goes on to say, "Never has the United Kingdom looked more divided and more polarized than, and that UK governance is fundamentally flawed and needs to be rethought and rebooted." The whole system, according to him, is dying, and that's really what Gove is telling us. And I think it's summed up in a report that was commissioned, and I haven't been able to quite track this down. It's commissioned for the leader of the opposition's office, but I think it might be Corbyn and not Starmer. It's called The Remaking of the British State. For the many, not the few. That sounds a Corbyn kind of slogan. And the report says this, and I think it sums up the present situation. There is an existential crisis facing the British state. It's plagued by huge economic and political imbalances, an inordinate centralization of power and wealth, vast regional inequalities across the UK, and an empty commitment to devolution. The old constitution, it says, is creaking under the weight of completing nationalism's identity politics and the disconnect between ordinary people and the British political and economic elite centered on Westminster and the City of London. And in all of that, he sums up the really deep crisis that this country is facing right now. I wanted to bring in not just failing and not just dying, which I believe it is. I thought I'd introduce my own idea into it, just to bring a thought in, because it does well get us back to it. I would have call it a zombie state. It's a description I want to add. It's the best description as an analogy of the present state of the United Kingdom. I think we've all seen the zombie films. I think there's Shaun of the Dead, there's Zombie Apocalypse, there's Dawn of the Dead, there's Night of the Living Dead, and many, many more. Zombies, of course, are not human. They are the living dead, having the appearance of humans about them. So one of the lessons I learned from these films is that zombies are very dangerous and need to be killed off immediately and without delay. We could go back then to, let's make a historical references. We could go back to February 1649, when the House of Commons passed a resolution saying that the monarchy and the House of Lords were useless and dangerous. And this is what our zombie state is, not merely useless, but dangerous. And it's dangerous to our lives and to our liberties. So we can't hold off in a dying system, in a failing system, which is becoming a dangerous system, and it will become dangerous to our lives and to our liberties if we don't do something about it. A couple more points. I don't know how I'm doing time-wise, Larry. Is that okay? I've got a couple more points and then I'll conclude.
5 minutes to do.
Okay, well, that should be enough time then. I want to ask myself, when did this dying state, when did it become a zombie state? Let's start off that question. I think the moment the UK state crossed the line into zombification, if you like, was not when Jeremy Corbyn was elected in 2015, but in 2016, when England and Wales voted to leave the European Union and Northern Ireland and Scotland voted to remain. And the Tories then took control of the situation. The Union of England with Northern Ireland and Scotland came to an end with that vote, from which there is no escape. The union is finished. The people have spoken, and we are now living in a zombie union. This is most obviously in the case of Northern Ireland, now trapped in the killing zone between the European Union and the British Union. And it's only a matter of time before Ireland does become united. And the quicker it becomes, the better it is for all of us, because the more drawn out it is, then we get the danger that the bonfires of loyalist sectarianism will be lit again. Scotland is arriving at the same moment, and Wales will follow suit. So my last point before I'll come to mention PR, because I haven't mentioned PR. I know it's about PR, so I'll come back to that, but it does fall out from the argument here. My last point is, how can we end the zombie state before it does much more damage to people generally and to the working class in particular? I think we need a republic in England. I think there has to be a united Ireland, an independence for Scotland and Wales, after which there could be a federal solution to it. But unfortunately, neither abolishing the House of Lords nor proportional representation will kill the zombie state. It will live on through those things. So the political point is that we cannot save the zombie state or revive it with various reformist stratagems. It has to be killed off as quickly as possible. The idea that we can revive it by various other reforms is not going to work. And the idea that introducing proportional representation will save, as I'm afraid to say, is for the birds. Now, it's not because I'm against proportional representation. Proportional representation is more democratic than first past the post. I'm clear about that. And if we had a republic, I think we'd have proportional representation in it. My concern, however, is that we've ended up at a point where this is now, in a way, a diversion from the more fundamental change, fundamental democratic change that we need in this country. And it might divert people's attentions, but it's not the answer that we need. So I'm going to end on this point, if I could. We have to go back, I think, to Gove's quote from Gramsci about the political crisis. Our unionist constitutional monarchy is dying, and in its zombie state is becoming dangerous for the working class. Yet the republic is not ready to be born. It's a political crisis and one of paralysis. We have to go forward, but we're not ready to do so. And this is why we're stuck in a kind of crisis of democracy. Why is the republic not ready to be born? Well, there's not widespread political consciousness that radical democratic change to achieve a democratic and social republic is either possible or necessary. But Ben was telling us about this 30 years ago, and it's a message that we need to take up. The problem is that there's no Republican Party. A mass Republican Party says that one or more social classes is ready to make this leap to a new future. But we're not there yet, and certainly the Labour Party is not there with it yet. The demand for proportional representation, there for me, is not wrong. It's more democratic, but it's a diversion from the more fundamental tasks. So we can agree with the supporters of PR that first past the post is not democratic, but that under the present system, we're neither going to get PR, or we're going to take a very long time to get it, or we're going to get a bodge version of it that the Liberal Democrats tried to get in 2011. So let's not concentrate on that. Let's concentrate on taking the message of Tony Benn up and getting the working class movement, getting the Labour Party to adopt a democratic and social Republican perspective.
Thank you very much, Steve.
And that's that. Thank you, comrades.
I'd just like to add one element to Steve's contribution. One is I didn't realise he was a film critic, and I think the films that he's watching are quite questionable. But the other thing is,
I didn't actually watch them. I just looked them up.
Oh, see, secret whispers again. I'm going to refer to the Bristol people that removed the figure of Colliston in the docks. There was that the BBC broadcast a a police commander at that particular time. And he made a strange statement, which I've never heard on the television before. And he said, "We are crown servants, not servants of the public or public servants." And I thought that was quite strange for him to say, because it crystallized something in my mind in relation to the police and its relationship with the proletariat. And that emphasizes the fact that the crown has executive powers. And that's the thing that we have to challenge. So I'd like to call on Tina Werkmann, to chair of the Labour Against the Witchhunt and secretary of the Labour Left Alliance. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you. I'm going to put this in here. I don't want to hold this down. If I can get it in. Yeah, technician to the microphone. Okay. That was quite funny, Steve's contribution, particularly at the end, I think, when you talked about PR as a diversion. It will take way too many years. And, you know, can you imagine? No, it's a diversion from the real struggle, which is, of course, exactly what people usually say when you tell them you're Republican. That's a diversion, you know. It's one fight against the monarchy. Oh, boring. What we need is the class war, as if that's somehow different from getting rid of the monarchy. So I think he's actually making the same mistake when it comes to things like PR than many people others do when we talked about first having an LLA working group on Republicanism. And I think I'm a different kind of Republican to Steve, actually, which I always suspected, but it's become clearer and clearer. I think Steve is quite fetishistic, I think, about the Republic, but doesn't see it in the context of why Republicanism. And I sort of structured my notes a little along those lines. Why am I a Republican, and why do I think every socialist should be a Republican? Let's start with why I'm not. I'm not because I think the monarchy is too expensive, and it bloody is. It cost something like, last time I looked this up, it was the lady at the top, the Queen has something like a £350 million personal fortune. That was a few years ago. And she still gets something like 40 million quid a year for her family, to all the various expenses they have. That's just the official figure. Supporters of the monarchy can easily fight back, shoot back, saying that, you know, the monarchy brings in so much money, tourism and this, and, you know, the Kate effect, you know, when she wears a dress and everybody buys it, all the things that it does to business, etc. So I think that's a really daft argument, and it's the kind of argument you hear a lot from I think SWP and things like that, you know, when there's a royal birth or something. Oh, they're sponges, they're parasites. They kind of are, but I don't think that's the point. I'm also not a Republican because I believe that an independent president or something like that would be better to run the country, or the head of state of the country, like, for example, the Republic campaign argues for. Terrible campaign, I think. There's no such thing as really independence from politics, is there? And there was a bit of a crass example, but in Germany, you know, Adolf Hitler was officially appointed by the independent President Hindenburg. It's crass, but it's independence is a fig leaf and doesn't really exist. So I'm against any elected heads of state instead. I can't even say I'm particularly upset about revelations that the royals are, shock, horror, getting involved in politics after all. Would you believe it? And the Queen has apparently, and her lawyers, been involved in redrafting and rejecting sometimes thousands of laws, you know, behind the scenes, where they're getting involved in it. Obviously, you know, makes total sense. Or even that Prince Charles is promising visas in return for big donations to his charities, which, like all charities, are very charitable, chiefly to the people running them, you know, on 6-figure salaries, etc. It's outrage. But that doesn't make me a Republican either. I think these are all sort of side issues that are people getting distracted about. I think I'm a Republican because the issue of how we're ruled goes to the heart of the kind of society we're fighting for. But that we believe the working class should run society. So, and not, you know, we're not subjects of anybody. We should be our own agents. We should be in charge of our own destiny. So it's not a diversion. It goes to the heart of what we believe socialism is. So ignoring that the monarchy makes us into subjects that cannot, by definition, take charge of society, plays a crucial role. The continuing existence of the monarchical system plays a crucial role, I think, in keeping things just the way they are, keeping us as subject and keeping class society just as it is. I mean, for somebody coming from Germany, you can tell by my funny accent, this is the class system in Britain is, whoa, mind-boggling, seriously mind-boggling. And we got rid of our monarch 1918, chased him out of the country, like so many other countries when there was a revolutionary upheaval in the earlier 20th century, getting rid of their monarchy. Britain's monarchy has survived in its current form. It does not mean it cannot come under threat again. And that was quite interesting. 1997, the heartless monarchy over Princess Diana's death, that actually shook them to the core. That was when public opinion really changed, and it took, against the cold queen, who's normally so motherly and all, and suddenly she looked like that cold woman, wouldn't even put the flag up, and are they really one of us? That's actually that mindset. Are they really like us? Obviously they're not, and that became really quite obvious. Or Prince Andrew, useless kid. He's epitomizing how there's one rule for them and one rule for us. He's hiding in his mum's castle in Scotland so that he can't get the legal papers from lawyers. I think he's accepted it now, but it's been going on for a good few years, and concretely in a few weeks has been hiding there for. And then there's of course the racism issue around Meghan Markle, which is doing a lot of harm to the monarchy, and that's just on an image kind of basis. So clearly it's not indestructible. It's not an indestructible institution, and it has been challenged in the past, and hopefully we should be challenging it again. But I think the fetishizing, and I think that's a bit what Steve does, fetishizing the fight for a republic is also wrong. Germany, the USA, Israel, these are all republics. So, and what? It doesn't bring us one step closer to socialism. Britain, Australia are not any further away from socialism than Germany and the US and Israel are at the moment. So I don't think we need a second bourgeois revolution, which I kind of sometimes think that would be okay with Steve, if it's somebody at the Liberal Democrats or somebody fighting to get rid of the monarchy, that'll do. It's as long as there's a republic, it doesn't matter how it's come about, etc. I think that's quite wrong. I think it should be us, the working class from below, taking this issue very seriously, because we are taking the fight for democracy serious, because we are the only Democrats. We're the only ones who actually want the majority to be in charge, and not a small elite on behalf of the majority. We actually want everybody to take charge of their own lives and rule society together. So that's why history shows that the downfall of a monarchy, almost without exception, has always coincided with the revolutionary situation. So we can't rely on other forces to do it for us. The fight for a republic is very intrinsically linked with the fight for socialism and for democracy, and that's what we're trying to bring about. So it's not the fight for a republic is not a diversion from the struggle for socialism, but very much part of it, to democratize all of society from top to bottom. And that's what republicanism is for me, and that's why I also was quite pushy about bringing PR into this discussion. And I wasn't so popular in the Republican Labour group, but kind of, if I'm speaking, I can speak about what I want, so I don't want to speak about it PR. And we also snuck it into the title because this is a big issue, I think, and it's a shame this hasn't been discussed elsewhere at the Rialto. And of course, funnily enough, it's just being debated at Labour Party conference this minute, or in this period. I'm not even sure how it's going. And you'd think this is it makes a lot of sense, fighting for PR, doesn't it, in terms of it's more democratic, etc. And yet comrades like Steve are sort of do it, whatever, it doesn't affect us. Comrades in the campaign for Labour Party democracy are actively arguing against PR, which I find still quite mind-boggling until you look a bit closer where they come from politically. But they've been dishing out their yellow pages saying, you know, delegates should vote against PR. You think, why on earth? So I've looked at their leaflet, and it says, so the last sentence, my favorite, PR would see off a united Labour Party, backed by the trade unions and any prospect of a majority Labour government. So I mean, where to start is one sentence, you know, PR would see off a united Labour Party backed by the trade unions and any prospect of a majority Labour government. Where to start with that sentence? After 6 years of the right wing hammering us, you know, nonstop, they're still appealing for unity with the right. It seems very, very odd. These people are pining still for a united Labour Party. This is a kind of social democratic mindset. I think that would also makes you believe that a majority Labour government will somehow introduce socialism in Parliament. It will not. You know, we are in the Labour Party, involved in the Labour movement. Well, I was expelled, but you know, we're all involved in the Labour movement, and you know, hoping to fight in the Labour Party. But to believe that the Labour Party will introduce socialism on our behalf is not happening. That's not actually true. And I would have thought CLPD comrades know that as well. But in their mindset, this is how the stage is almost like the Morning Star, the Communist Party of Britain, road to socialism. You know, you have to go step by step in a more left-wing Labour Party, and then a bit more left-wing and more left-wing, and then they can have a law to declare socialism, which is a very funny way of getting to socialism. It's not socialism, is it? It'll be some kind of, I don't know, state-run Stalinistic type idea. But in order to get there, of course, you have to keep quiet. You have to keep quiet on the witch hunt. You have to keep quiet on the bans and proscriptions, you know, because you can't threaten that unity. You can't threaten that possibility of a Labour government. But that is a very different kind of socialism that I'm fighting for. So I don't want to go into the details of various PR systems. It can be very complicated. Don't know if comrades have heard about the German elections just now. It's quite interesting. The Linke Party, which I might or might not be still a member, I can't remember when I last paid, but there's a threshold of 5% to get into Parliament, and they've had 4.9% of the vote, very close. However, because they've got 3 directly elected MPs locally, they had a majority, like first past the post, they had a majority. So those 3 get into Parliament, and if that happens, all your other MPs come in as well. So despite getting under the threshold, that's getting their full quota, which is, I think, 39 MPs now get into the German Parliament. Had it not been for those 3 directly elected ones, they wouldn't have got in at all. So it's lucky, you know, really, really lucky. But there are different systems like that, so it's no point getting into the details of that. But I think for the point is, for socialists, and from my point of view, like Parliament can be a useful platform. And that's about it. That's why PR is quite useful, that socialists could get together, form a viable alternative outside the Labour Party, which is a problem at the moment with the first past the post system. It's been tried many, many times to build a political party outside the Labour Party, and they tend to either, you know, degenerate into sects very quickly. Well, that's what mostly happens, or fizzle out and die a painful death. Had you got a different kind of voting system, of PR kind of system, then the possibility of actually getting somebody into Parliament in order to use it as a platform, you know, fight for reforms, etc., that kind of thing, would be very useful and would help embolden and bring an organization like that together. I think. I mean, we have to discuss where we're going now anyway with the Labour Party as it is. But I think the electoral system in Britain and the continued affiliation of unions to the Labour Party makes an alternative very difficult. And that's one of the reasons why we should be fighting for PR. In Germany, Karl Liebknecht, for example, he didn't stop the war, didn't stop the First World War. He didn't even stop the Social Democrats, his party, approving the so-called war credits. They did approve it, but dear God, his speech has gone down in history. His speech against war credits, he stood up as the only person, a bit like Chris Williamson did against the witch hunt. He was the only person in Parliament standing up and fighting against the war. And it's, you know, it's over 100 years ago, and people still look at his speech and still see it as an inspiration. And this is, for me, one of the most vibrant reasons why PR is a very good thing that we should fight for. So that somebody like Karl Liebknecht, you know, like Jackie Walker, can you imagine what she doing in Parliament? It would be fantastic. In Germany, there are Linke MPs who are using Parliament as a platform like that. Christine Buchholz, for example, she's a member of the German section of the SWP. Better than the SWP, actually. I quite like her. I've known her for many, many years. And she's, you know, she's one of the very few who will stand up and talk against, in opposition to what Israel is doing. It's also in opposition to her own party, actually. But she is, you know, she is using Parliament as a platform. And I think PR can be very, very useful for that. So PR, like the fight against the monarchy, are only tools, I think, to get us closer to socialism. And unless we see that as a whole, that it's about, you know, empowering the working class and from below and giving us all the tools possible and necessary to fight for our own liberation. That's how you, that's for me is a Republican worldview. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's elements in Tina's contribution that should certainly fit into a transitional program alongside Republicanism.
I'm not a Trotter.
No, I think the Trotskyists have claimed the transitional program. I think it's a working class right to have a transitional program. What I'd like to do now is introduce Kevin Bean, lecturer of the Irish politics at the Institute of Irish Studies at University in Liverpool. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Right. I think Tina's been a little bit hard on Prince Andrew. I mean, everybody has a right to go home to mother when things aren't quite working out. And, you know, I always think it's a rather endearing trait that, I mean, don't you hide in your mum's castle when you've got a problem. But I find myself in the position of the third speaker, where a lot of the points have been taken up. And so I'm going, in a sense, to go around and go for the sort of scraps that are lying around on the floor. I think that Tina put it very well when she said that the question of the monarchy is not particularly about privilege or expense. It's actually really about power, and in particular about principle. And I think that in Britain, there's been a tremendous mystification of power and the nature of power. Steve used the term crown in Parliament, and I'm glad he explained it, because I would say that it's one of the more obscure terms that if you were to go onto the street in one of those famous vox pops and say, what is crown in Parliament? Somebody might think it has something to do with the state opening of Parliament, the idea of the Queen delivering the Queen's speech and so forth. But the term is very rarely used. I came across it at school. I had in many ways, very useful when I did my O-levels. I did one on the history of the British Constitution. So I remember going through these terms and talking about them with people, and in particular trying to explain the nature of monarchical power. Now, the point about monarchical power is that the monarch actually isn't the question. It's actually the concentrations of power that take on a royal form. They, for example, really lie in the executive power of the Prime Minister and a number of other institutions that have that monarchical form. And one of the problems often with the focus on, quote, the monarchy, is that it does turn into a debate about the Queen or a particular individual. And one of the points that Tony Benn, I think, did raise very correctly was to point to the nature of that power, which in particular lies with the Prime Minister, because many of the monarchical powers rest there. It's a concentration of power in that way. Tina referred to the Weimar Republic in Germany. And again, I won't bore you with my, my school days when I learned about that. But the point about that constitution, although it was a pretty democratic constitution, it was actually, in a sense, an elected monarchy, because one of the reasons why Hindenburg was able to act in the way that he did was, in fact, to use emergency powers, ruling by decree on occasions. And it was, again, this idea of concentrations of power. So I think what we're looking at here in terms of the Republic is the idea of the real nature of democracy and where power lies. We're talking about what sort of society we want. And both Tina and Steve in their various ways have done that. And Tina in particular linked the nature of power in our society to its monarchical form. But we're talking about power should reside in the citizen, it should reside in the population, it should reside in the working class. And that, I think, is the issue. Very rarely in debates on the monarchy, or indeed in any debates on constitutional matters, is that point made. I could go on for a long time talking about the concentrations of power in Britain, but I want to really get that point particularly home, that powers are, the Prime Minister has sort of quasi-presidential monarchical powers, and those, you know, this is where this form crown in Parliament is so significant. The other element which Steve did again correctly draw on is this the sort of nature and the concentration of this power over and above that of not the citizen, because we're not citizens in Britain, we're subjects, over and above that of the population. So, for example, the relationship between an MP and their constituents is not, in constitutional terms, in any real sense, representative. That it has an autonomy, in a sense. It rests, it sort of stands above society. Again, historically, that derives from monarchical power, because the Lords, but also the Commons, were originally bodies drawn together to advise the monarch. And those constitutional forms, although they seem archaic, I mean, there's lots of nonsense. I'm sure Chris will tell us about banging on doors and, you know, 2 swords lengths and your little bit of ribbon where you hang your jacket up so that you can put your sword in and all the rest. There's all this sort of thing there. But what that does is in many ways to mystify it, and also to give it the idea that somehow it's a rather sort of quaint survival. Again, when you go to Parliament as a visitor and you look around and you're sort of rather overawed by all this pseudo feudalism, and much of that is a relatively modern invention, and much of it is just nonsense and mummery. It's just an attempt to hide the realities of that power, and it, you know, does an excellent job. If you listen to the state opening of Parliament, the commentator lowers his voice. Black Rod is now approaching the door, knocks 3 times. I think it is 3, isn't it? Yeah. Bang, 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 slam. This, of course, goes back to those rather unfortunate events in the 17th century. And so on. You can always tell when there's a royal story coming on because they adopt that voice. I can't keep it up for more than a few minutes. Along with bowing and scraping, it's a very acquired art, and it does take a lot of practice. But that sort of those sorts of concentrations of power do really, I think, seep into all parts of our society. So our opposition and our opposition to monarchical power, our opposition to the state, is not just some sort of a set of abstractions. It's about really what our conceptions of socialism and democracy are. And so I think Tina, you know, both Tina and Steve in the various ways have dealt with that. I want, though, to talk about the way that the Labour Party historically has sort of accepted that power. And again, Larry, when he introduced the talk today, sort of explained how the struggle for democracy in the Labour Party and the struggle for democracy in society, struggle for socialism are all very closely connected. If you recall, when Jeremy Corbyn was appointed leader, the big question came up about whether he would become a Privy Councillor, whether he would kiss the Queen's hand and so on, which is more metaphorical. Would he, in a sense, accept the system? And there's all sort of umming and ahhing about that. Now, Jeremy Corbyn was one of the signatories of the Commonwealth Bill that Steve's referred to. And he's one of the few MPs that's been fairly consistently Republican. But when I think placed into that position, I think he equivocated. He said, well, you know, sort of like a private matter, really. You know, I mean, you know, some people do this and some people do that. Some people sort of like dictatorships. Sorry, no, he didn't say that. But the point was, he was, I think, blurring the issue, and it isn't a private matter. It's not even, in a sense, a sort of moral attack on waste and about behavior and so forth. It really does go to the question of power. And I think the point is that Labour, as Larry said, is a loyalist party, is loyal to the constitution and to the state. Now, I'm a disloyalist. You know, I think we should be disloyal because that monarchy and that state represents a system that we should be opposed to. And of course, there's a very fine tradition in this country. There's a better tradition than all that flummery of knocking on doors and riding around in rather grotesque coaches. And that is the tradition of the Chartists and the tradition of the Levellers and the tradition of the English Revolution, which is not often taught in school. Now, I was again very fortunate. I must have had some Bolsheviks amongst my teachers. I did all that. I read all those Leveller documents as a 17 and 18-year-old. I even wanted, still really worth getting hold of, an old tape recording of some actors doing the Putney debates. Fantastic stuff, really subversive, talking about basic democratic ideas. And of course, from those ideas come eventually, through the revolutionary and the democratic movements, we get the influence then into the Socialists and the Labour movement. But of course, the other tradition in the Labour movement is state loyalism. And of course, alongside state loyalism is in effect loyalty to capitalism. So our politics then become the politics of reform. How can we as socialists accept something that concentrates power in very, very few hands? We're talking about power in the hands of the working class. We're talking about really a remodeling of society. Just a few words on PR, which I actually think is quite important for the reasons that Tina said. I don't know the way that the debate is going at the moment. I was listening to it before I came along to the meeting. But I think one of the problems for the supporters of PR is that it has become a panacea, and it's also been sort of, in a sense, taken out of context, because the motion that's up before the conference just focuses on the PR system, and it says that those societies with the lowest levels of inequality and social exclusion all have proportional voting systems. Now, there's a bit of a logical fallacy, I think, in there about cause and effect. But I think that if we were going to advocate for PR, and I am, personally in favor of it, we also ought to have a lot of other things alongside it, because it doesn't make sense having a democratic electoral system with, for example, an unelected House of Lords, or indeed any form of secondary chamber. It doesn't make sense in having prime ministerial power, in effect, a presidential system. It doesn't make sense with having a monarchy. In other words, we need a full democratic, renovation. We need to be demanding that type of system. We also need, if we're going to elect people, not just to elect a privileged crowd who stand above us in terms of salaries and position. We need to talk about how they're paid, how they're accountable, their relationship with their constituents. In other words, PR is just one part of the program. My suspicion, and this is perhaps where I'm going to move more into contemporary comment as opposed to theoretical work, is that the supporters of PR have another agenda here. And that is, of course, that they look forward to a series of coalition governments. When they talk about the operation of PR in other countries, they're looking forward to those systems of very centrist, very pro-capitalist coalition governments. And their ideal, I suppose, is of a Labour Party in coalition with a whole series of myriad parties that will, in a sense, be, vaguely reformist, maybe not particularly reformist at all, but just managing the system. And they will do that with a whole series of smaller parties. The negotiations are already going on in Germany in that regard, and the SPD are entering into discussions not just with the Greens, but also with the very Thatcherite FDP. So I think that is in many ways the political slant of this. But our opposition or our approach to this, I think, should be for a democratic republic, but also for the reasons that Tina said in terms of our attitude to government. My conception of socialism is not one that's going to be delivered from on high, and that the struggle for a democratic republic is in fact the struggle for socialism, but it's the struggle to put power in the hands of the working class. And that means that if we stand for the self-emancipation of the working class, then PR and democratic reforms are means to give the platform, the means to do that. And Tina referred to Karl Liebknecht in 1916 as well, but also his father. There was a fine tradition in that family of standing up and using Parliament, using the Reichstag as a platform, as a tribune. And that, I think, is not because those people saw the possibilities of developing socialism through that, but as a way of pointing where power lay in German society, and as using that as a tribune to enthuse and to inspire people, as indeed was the case when the German social democratic movement was built, and indeed was the case in 1918 when the German working class overthrew that monarchy. The fact that they didn't complete the job and go on to socialism also tells us something about social democrats, in that the people who stopped that were the German SPD, and indeed the people who murdered Luxemburg and Liebknecht were the German officer corps in alliance. And that shows really where loyalism leads you. I'm not accusing Keir Starmer of anything. Okay. Anyway, thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Kevin. If I can take a liberty as chair, and so one of the points that Kevin raised was that it's the power going into workers' hands, and the key to that is the education, and the education that Kevin obviously experienced, because the power that I was taught when I was at school was and that was a Catholic school, and that was the power of the Holy Trinity. How to learn the catechism and how to genuflect properly on Sundays. And, the other issue is that Chartism, if somebody had said that when I was 15 or 14 years of age, I would have looked towards the New Musical Express to see who was at the top of the pops. And this is the failure, I think, within the educational system is certainly for working class people, is to enlighten them into working class history. And this is the bones. If I'm privileged to sit on the platform with people that have got more working class history academically, but my education has been through the shop floor and a year in dispute with News International. And without the support of my family and many comrades, we would not have seen that year plus without the solidarity of working class people. So what I'd like to do is, I assume we're taking questions this afternoon. Is anyone got a burning issue with anything that's been said on the platform? So you're going to have to. Or an unburning, yeah, unburning. Yeah, any questions at all? apart from when are we going to get out of this stuffy atmosphere?
I think it might be an idea.
I was just going to speak.
Good afternoon. Faraz Khan, Cambridge, suspended Labour member. The third day of Faraz Khan, Cambridge, suspended Labour member. The third day is going to be about the way forward. Could you tell us what the concepts relate to the panel have expressed relate to how they relate to what might happen on the third day?
Okay. I didn't get it.
Yeah. Yeah. How does it pertain the concepts you've introduced?
Okay. It's up to the chair who speaks next. I'm willing.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, well, okay. No, I thought it was interesting, Tina's comments about Steve saying, you know, he doesn't mind whether it's a bourgeois, Steve will answer, of course, but whether it's a bourgeois republic or not, you know, because I think that organisation follows from your aims. You know, when we got political aims, you organise accordingly, don't you? And in that sense, I don't know. But I mean, I'm for, I would say I'm for Republican democracy. Maybe Marx used the term extreme democracy. And I wanted to work out the logic of that. I mean, here we've got the people we send to Parliament or to councils, you know, the representatives of the party tend to rule the party, don't they? They're rulers instead of servants. And we see that with the proposal from Starmer, you know, if he could reverse back to when the MPs chose the leader. And then you come to the leader question. I mean, who wants a Führer, right? You get however he's made or she's made, you know, the leader of the Labour Party tells the MPs what to do, gives away jobs and lots of, you know, good, well-paid posts and that, especially if they become Prime Minister. So you've got the whole parliamentary Labour Party sucking up to the leader so that they'll get a good place. That's a tendency. I'm not saying they all do that, but that's a tendency. The representatives are on a career path. You know, Labour Party is a career path. Left Labour, official left Labour is a career path. And I must say, it's really nice to be amongst people here in the various left meetings where you've got people who've been active all their life, working hard for Labour and working hard for socialism, who don't get paid a penny, you know, who are doing it selflessly, right? That's really good. That's what we should have. That's why we should have the principle of a worker's MP on a worker's wage, isn't it? So that's a question, the Führer principle. We don't like it. First past the post. Well, the reason why the campaign for Labour Party democracy is saying, I'm going to second guess them. I think this is what their reasoning is. The reason they don't like PR is because they want to win a minority Labour government. Like their perspective is to get a Labour government based on not having a majority of the working class, right? The working class is the big majority of the population in the UK. And so we should be, as socialists, we shouldn't want to creep in surreptitiously, get hold of power, despite the fact people don't want it, and then impose our view, right? You can't do that. This won't work, you know. That's the road to the end, isn't it? So what we need to do is to win the majority. And of course, one of the ways of doing that is to accept being a minority, you know, make your arguments and win, right? And we've got to fight all sorts of aspects. The election method is, you know, is a secondary question. It's a question, right? It's an important question, but it's not the only one. And we've got to win. We've got to win the majority of the working class for socialism. In the working class movement, that's where we need extreme democracy first, because, you know, the kind of society you'll produce depends on the kind of movement that fights for it. And in all of our, I mean, even in the tiny bureaucratic sects on the left, You know, you've got people being expelled by a text message from the SWP, for example. You know, for writing something or saying something. That kind of thing goes on. That's just one example, you know, but you've got that sort of behavior. So we need a culture on the left that we can debate anything, unity in action and freedom of discussion. And that culture can go up to the top. It can be brought into all the trade unions. The trade union bureaucracy can be brought to heel. So they're representatives and not rulers.
Thank you very much, Dan. Is there anybody indicating out there? I can't quite see where underneath. Yeah, comrade in the corner. Thank you.
It's Esther. No, Esther's hiding in the corner.
Hello, that's because I was drinking my coffee. Thank you very much for those amazing presentations. I wanted to say something about the structures that maintain privilege within the system, some of which have been addressed in Labour Party policy in the past. And the one I'm thinking of in particular is the education system, which does link to the royal family and the aristocracy, but it also links to the massive privilege extended to those people that have the privilege to have private education, who then go on to take all the privileged positions in society, from the judiciary through to the Houses of Parliament, and many, many senior positions in our society. So I'd like to hear from the panel on some specifics about not just republicanism, but within the worker-run society, which specific policies we should be advocating for that help people to see exactly what a society run along the lines of control by the workers would look like. And that for me would definitely include the immediate abolition of private education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrade. But just to come back on what type of republicanism, I think we've got to have a republicanism that enhances democracy, because if we don't have the democracy within our structures of working class organisations, then we're never going to get to republicanism. And that's why I say it has to be a combination of internationalism, democracy, and republicanism to bring about a socialist society. But I'll ask Steve, do you want to make any comments on the last points that were made there? Are you there, Steve?
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Just to comment on a couple of things, shall I, Larry? That first of all, Esther said, yes, I think that if we're thinking of Republican principles and Republican democratic ideas, then we should be able to have an education policy that absolutely reflects those. And that's really what we need. We haven't got that far. There ought to be a Republican democratic education policy. First of all, education has to be secular. A lot of our education is tied to religious, Church of England or different religions. So secular education. Equality, you're absolutely right. We can't have education for the rich and education for everybody else. So I completely agree with that. The abolition of the so-called public schools. Equality is important. I would say that you would want the schools to be run in a democratic fashion. So you would have, let's say, for example, a school council where all the workers, not just the teachers, all the workers in school would be represented, and there would be meetings. I suppose you have meetings already, but there would be meetings, and there'd be ways even of talking to students too in all of that. So you'd try to run a school as a democratic institution, not as a bureaucracy. But it would be in the context of a Republican, a wider national Republican education policy. So I think republicanism, secularism is a Republican kind of principle, by the way. So that would be something I think is very important. Now, that's just off the top of my head. I think what we should be doing is, in making our case for a democratic republic, we should have part of that is what is a Republican education policy? How would schools be run in a democratic and Republican way? In other words, where power rests with the people who work in that place. A republic, a Republican school, if you want to think of it another way. I might just make a couple of other points if I could. I think we did in the Republican Labour Working Group draw a distinction between a presidential republic, and I think Kevin has already commented on that, where what you've almost got is elected monarch, as you have in America. You elect the king every 4 years, but you limit his power by not letting him have more than 2 terms. So the Americans decided, well, they call it a republic, but it's really an elected monarchy. And they give the executive power to the president. It's bureaucratic and executive power. That's not the republic we're talking about here. Okay, although it's called a republic. We're talking about a democratic republic where power must come from below. And if we've had glimpses of that in the Paris Commune, in the Russian Soviets in 1917, in the Kronstadt Rebellion in 1921, we could go on with a few more, but the real question is that sovereignty rests with the people, in this case, the working people, who elect and make their representatives accountable and subject to recall and paid no more than the average wage. It has to come from below. And although it was Lincoln used the phrase government of the people, by the people, for the people, they never really got that. I think that is a very excellent Republican idea. Yes, we want government of the people, by the people, for the people. And I think socialist ideas make that possible, because we can't have government of the people, by the people, for the people, if all the property in the country is owned by a few monopolies. You know, that seems to republicanism and private property ultimately in contradiction with one another. And if the working class don't want to abolish capitalism, they'd certainly like to have some democracy. And at that point, they'd realize that this democracy is not going to work if we leave these massive concentrations of economic power in private hands. So republicanism is not the same as socialism, but republicanism and democracy carried out consistently leads you to socialistic conclusions. I think that was Marx's point. And my final point would be this, just in response to Tina, because Tina did misunderstand the point I was trying to make, I think. And I think if we ask ourselves, why is republicanism so weak in the socialist movement? Why is Tony Benn really a kind of an exception in what he advocated? And why have we forgotten all about it anyway? It's so unimportant that we forgot about it. And part of it is to do with the mystification that Kevin rightly pointed to, mixing up the Queen and the Crown. Bourgeois republicanism wants to get rid of the Queen and have a president. That's not what we're saying as socialist Republicans. We're identifying the Crown in exactly the way that Kevin did. The Crown is actually the power of capital. But we think it's the Queen. We think it's the Queen. We think it's not doing any harm, so we needn't bother with it. And yet it can exercise a massive power in the way that Larry mentioned when when he mentioned the policeman in Bristol. The power of the Crown extends right through our societies. It's huge. It's a big corporate power. It's the state by another name in this country, if you want to put it like that. So the Crown in Parliament is the state in Parliament. Who's exercising the state power? It's not really the Queen, but it's Boris Johnson, the chief executive of the Crown. Again, as Kevin emphasised. And I think we have to get away from focusing too much attention on the monarchy and simply being anti-monarchists, and rather making a positive case for a democratic republicanism. And I wanted to come back to that, well, I will make another final point. The RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party, circa 1903, didn't have proportional representation in its programme. Russian Social Democratic Labour, think about that. Social Democratic, it was Republican. So you could say it was Russian Republican Labour Party, if you wanted to think of it in those ways. But Lenin did bring in proportional representation later on. They did have it, but they never wanted to turn the Duma, elect the Duma by PR particularly. What their key thing to do was to get rid of the Tsarist system. And my key point I wanted to get over to the audience was that the system we've got now is in a seriously difficult, bad state. And we can't ignore it. It's not something we can put off for 100 years. We have got to really start to think very seriously about a state which is collapsing about our ears as a result of recent political developments. We're going to be forced down to try to catch up and bring up our Republican ideas, as it were, up to date.
Thank you, Steve. Tina's indicated she'd like to respond.
Thank you. Yeah, actually agree with Steve's second contribution more than with the first. Capitalism in decline is interesting, isn't it? Because that definitely is happening. I mean, we're just in Britain because of Brexit as well, and then you know, kind of fuel shortages. I'm not sure I'm going to get back to Sheffield by car and stuff like that. It's just totally irrational what's happening at the moment on a global level with, you know, capitalism clearly cannot continue. It's struggling, it's falling apart at the seams, but there's the issue of our forces not being quite ready or not even close to being ready to pushing it over. But by dear God, it does need to be pushed over soon, doesn't it? With the inequalities getting worse and worse and worse. You know, the big companies having so much money, it's coming out of their ears. They don't know where to invest it in anymore because they're making huge profits, while, you know, the 80% of the globe are poor or starving. It cannot continue much longer, but we need to, and that's to Esther's point, which is of course a key, and for us as well. You know, how do we actually translate this into a program for us and to empower our forces? And that's where it gets a bit difficult. You know, we've seen this week at Labour Party conference how big a task we have ahead of us and how we've been smashed to pieces. And we could go into discussion, you know, what's gone wrong in the last 6 years, and I've got a whole few speeches on that as well about appeasement and etc. But that's not this meeting. But in terms of a program going forward, it was interesting, Esther mentioning, you know, abolishing private education, and that does sound like an obvious thing to fight for, but actually if you scratch it on the surface a little bit, then it basically means you allow or you hand it all over to the state, which of course it is at the moment as well. But the state, you know, indoctrinates our children on a massive level. And, you know, I can see it on my young daughter. It's a state school, and the guy, the head teacher, is, you know, telling them about how Jesus made water into wine, and that's like true, you know, that's actually happened. He did a magic trick with a, you know, water with the food coloring, but Jesus did it for real, don't you know? Jesus Christ, so to speak, you know. No, he did not do that. But, you know, our children are getting indoctrinated by the state, so that's not the solution either. I know, yeah, good luck. That's not the solution either. It's a bit like, you know, thinking that nationalization of the trains, etc., that will do it. Well, actually, you're just handing it to Boris Johnson. You know, it does not do it. You actually need workers' control from below. And so there's something to be said about, you know, cooperatives coming together to teach our children actually what is important. You know, some of the things that Kevin was fortunate enough to learn in school, you know, or about, you know, I had to come to Britain to learn about the German Revolution. You do not get told it in school. I wonder why. Obviously, they're not wanting to tell us about this. You know, this is the state is not doing a much better job than you know, the ruling class. I mean, they are part of the same class, obviously. So, you know, if we, you know, like we're trying to do, for example, in the LLA education program, I think this is more of sort of democratic way of our own forces, you know, our own history, examining our own history, because we cannot rely on the state to teach us that. They want us to teach us the opposite, so that we don't do revolution again. So this is, I think that's more of a sort of socialistic approach, that we take education out of the hands of the state and the ruling class, and do it that way around. Karl Marx actually said a really good quote, I think it's Marx or maybe it was Lenin, is, if we're all bureaucrats in a future socialist society, none of us are bureaucrats. Sounds bad being a bureaucrat, but he meant it in a way, if we're all be able to take over little bits of running the state, be it locally, be it, you know, running the schools, running, you know, the councils, running the neighborhood watch, whatever you do. But if you get involved locally, you know, you start at the bottom up, and we all getting involved in running bits of the state, then basically none of us are running the state. You know, then there isn't the hierarchy as you have in the moment. You can have then rotation of positions, etc. You could have, you know, annual elections, which is a demand by the Chartists, which which actually all demands by the Chartists were eventually were enforced by the state eventually, apart from annual elections, which is quite an interesting one and not undisputed on the left. I think it's quite a good idea. It takes the, it doesn't allow you to make unpopular decisions. You have to constantly be on your guard, and you could be, if you're doing something that does not find approval by the majority of the working class, you're out. And that's constantly, and then you get people, oh, it's too expensive on all these elections, spending millions on elections. It's of course a whole different system if you do it annually or even more often than that. You have to actually make sure that what you do is to the benefit of the working class and the majority of the population.
I'm seeing a lot of parallels between what you're describing there and the discussion we've just had about municipal socialism. So there are some threads that seem to be coming together and that we need to pick up and knit together. So I think across this conference, people are seeing lots of ways of getting towards a similar objective, and that's great. Thank you.
I was going to ask you if you were satisfied with the answers, Esther, but Kevin's indicated to come back in.
Yes, I'll just be brief. I think Stan, I did hear the contribution, Stan, although I was downstairs, it was carried. I think Stan was making an important point about democracy and accountability in our own movement. And I think that in a way, I don't want to make this sound utopian, because actually it isn't utopian, but I think we should see our own movement and indeed the way that we organize our lives and activities as, in a sense, education or schools for socialism. Because if you think about what we are really going for here is, and again, these sound almost like mission statements. We're talking about empowering people. Now, that doesn't mean giving power to people. It means that people take that power. And one of the things that struck me about the Labour Party conference was that power was sometimes dangled in front of people by the chair, but more often than not wasn't even dangled. It was just sort of stamped down on. And this is not a complaint about any of the delegates, but in a Republican Democratic Party, not the combination of the Americans, but a political party of the working class that's democratic, then delegates and members would not be treated like serfs, would not be told when they can and can't do things, when they can't move, or we want to discuss this, or we want to take a vote. That is an undemocratic culture. It's a bureaucratic culture, and it's grown up very strongly in the working class movement internationally. People were talking about bureaucratization of parties in the 19th century. And I see that, in the way that Stan was talking about leaders and followers, is as much a state of mind amongst, the mass of our population. It's the idea that we don't count. I don't know anything. Who am I to question the great and the good? And that is, limits democracy to a vote once every 5 years, or going along to a conference and being wheeled out as just a clapping squad for the leaders. I was a delegate to the Labour Party conference in the 1970s. And, I recall some of those conferences where Labour leaders were put on the spot. And if you don't believe me, look at some of the film footage. And this was when people were trying to get control of the movement. Now, I see that as the importance of democracy. And I see that type of control, that type of accountability can only happen when we, as members of the movement, or indeed if we're talking about Republican democracy, we as citizens, assert that control. We can in fact pass all the laws we like, although the ruling class will attempt to stop us. But what will not be able to stop us is if we develop a movement that is conscious of people who stand up for democracy and stand up for their politics. So it's actually a two-way street. We often blame leaders, and that's fine. They have betrayed us. They have done terrible things. but it's also something that we have to fight back about ourselves. In other words, creating a movement that has a democratic culture, and that comes from us. Those people in the English Revolution I was referring to had the argument that the littlest he, the poorest person, had as much right as the greatest he. And that used to be a slogan that the Labour Party had. It was, I think, Colonel Rainsborough, and they used to send it out to 18-year-olds. I remember when 18-year-olds got the vote, and they used to send it out on a birthday card to the local 18-year-olds. Well, of course, nowadays that might apply, but it doesn't apply inside the Labour Party because, of course, the littlest he is nowadays usually shut up or suspended or expelled. But it's still a really radical idea, and it's a fundamental idea of how a society should be organized. Just again, I won't usurp too much time, but I think Esther's point about education is important, and I think that the type of responses, both about the secularization of education, but the concentrations of power and wealth that go with it, and the control of it. So some of the things that Steve said, I think, are quite important. Again, the running of schools and the running of institutions and structures should be democratic, and there should be places where people learn to be democratic. One of the first places where you learn to shut up and do as you're told is in school. Now, you know, as a former school teacher and now a university academic, I'm torn in two ways on this one, because, but quite seriously, I think you have to train people to, you know, take part in democratic debate and say, well, what you're saying is important, you know. And so schooling not only trains us to be passive subjects, it also trains us to be obedient workers who, you know, turn up on time. Again, I'm not advocating lateness at school, but the point is that that comes from self-discipline. Now, again, some of this may sound utopian and it may sound slightly romantic, but it is actually the basis of democratic and socialist politics. And if we don't have it, then we can't do anything. You know, when I talk about the self-emancipation of the working class, that's not just a phrase, because my idea of socialism isn't going to get anywhere near unless the overwhelming mass of people want it and are willing to do something about it. And we've seen that historically, revolutions and mass movements have occurred. So, you know, we're fully grounded in historical experience, but it does go back to how we build that sort of movement. And I start with the areas that we can control, which is the culture and the democracy of our own movement and our own organizations. If we don't run them democratically, then how will other people run the rest of society? If we don't hold our own leaders to account, how will the structures of the state be held to account? So that's where we begin. You know, in another phrase, the real enemy is always at home.
I could take further opportunity, and that is that the issue of democracy in trade unions is always tested, and it's certainly tested during the miners' dispute and the print workers' dispute, in as much as that try and set up outside the bureaucracy of a trade union a strike committee. Now, strike committees were all important during both of those disputes, and certainly one of the elements that I certainly came across was setting up the London-wide print workers support groups in each borough, and that gave the opportunity to bring about workers' control and controlling your own destiny within the dispute itself. Was one other point I wanted to raise there. Oh, about the education. Yeah, that Kevin came back to us on education. Now, education sometimes, you know, it's the formal education, but there's also the education of practice on the shop floor and the practice of political enlightenment during strikes. And I've got to say that the problem is that we don't enhance that. Once those lessons are learned, they're not taken forward. They're not taken forward on a regular basis. They're education of the moment. And we need to enhance that on the left and galvanize those disputes. And we certainly learned as print workers from the miners' dispute. And that's why when I was given the opportunity to set up a union of print support groups in London and nationally. But then the union came down on me and wanted to expel me from the union because they thought I was setting up an alternative union. Now, this is you're not only fighting the employers, which was Murdoch at that particular time, but you're also fighting for democracy within your own trade unions. Just one other point that was when I was giving out leaflets yesterday down at the People's Assembly, I spoke to some people from Brighton Pavilion, and the opportunity of bringing republicanism onto the agenda, the working class agenda. They passed a motion on republicanism at the Pavilion CLP. Now, I haven't seen the motion, so I don't know what it said, but I was enlightened and encouraged by the fact that it's coming onto the agenda within the Labour Party. Is there any further contributions that anyone would like to make? I can't see any hands coming up. Steve, are you happy to conclude the meeting? We're a little bit early finishing, but
Well,
I'll make one.
left meeting anyway.
oh right.
No harm in finishing early.
No. Sorry, Steve, was you saying something?
I was just going to say my one takeaway point is that republicanism.
Okay.
Not just, sorry, if you can't, yeah, you can hear me. My just one last point was the one point I did want to try to get over, and I think it has to be thought about, is that not just that republicanism is a good idea, and it's been shown to be a good idea. Right? The points that were made about republicanism in the working class movement, practicing of it, but that we're in a situation in this country where we need to go in this direction because the alternative is quite dangerous. And that's the point I want to get. If we don't get our act together, we're living in quite a dangerous time. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Steve. Right, then what I'd like to do is thank the panel for their contributions and thank the colleagues and the comrades for their attendance to this meeting. But also I'd like to register the fact that the Resist have given us the opportunity to bring republicanism onto the agenda through the LLA and this particular platform. Anyway, thank you very much.